Okay, so we're going to be in Chapter 2, Section 3 today. We're going to discuss early state constitutions, analyze the Articles of Confederation, and evaluate the shape of the country after the Revolutionary War. And so that's going to be the stuff we're going to discuss in Section 2. That heat's pretty loud. Maybe you can still hear me. The American leaders had discussed the idea of independence, and their own constitutions, even before the Declaration of Independence was signed. Now, a constitution, all that is a written plan for government. Now, we've talked about the Mayflower Compact earlier, and the Mayflower Compact was the first written plan for government in the United States. Now, of course, at the time it was the colonies. They were just trying to settle at that point, but the idea is still the same. It's a written plan for government. They basically sat down and said, how do we want the government to go? And that's what a constitution is. Bicameral means two parts. Our legislature is a two-part bicameral legislature. That means that our Congress is split up into the House of Representatives and the Senate. It's two houses, two-part, and that's why it's called bicameral. Now, if you remember the word bi, you see that when it comes to two. Like bicycle has two wheels. Bifocals has two sets of lenses, or two different kinds. So that's the idea, is that bicameral means two parts. And so that's the way our government is set up. Each state set up a legislature to create laws, with most being bicameral. So most of the states had a two-house system like that we have today. These two parts were called houses. The government that was set up was the legislature would create laws, the governor would enforce the laws, and the judges in the courts would interpret the laws. This is the type of government we have today. We have a two-part Congress, the Senate and the House of Representatives. We have, on the state level, a governor that they would enforce the laws. They're the executive branch. The president, of course, is the executive branch over the country, but over the state government, and that's what we're talking about right now. The governor is the one that's over the executive branch. And the judges in the courts are the judicial branch. They make up the part that interprets the laws. And as we continue going, this is going to make a little bit more sense in terms of how these three parts of government works together as a whole. Most state constitutions included a Bill of Rights. This would guarantee basic freedoms of the people, such as trial by jury, a personal protection of property, and things like that. And this can be traced back to the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights. Now, if you remember from Section 1 of this chapter, we talked about the Magna Carta and the fact that they basically went up to the king and said, hey, we have certain rights that you can't take away from us, so deal with it, and made him sign the Magna Carta. Because of this, people realized from then on, hey, we've got certain rights that the government can't take away. And so a Bill of Rights is just a list of personal freedoms that the government doesn't have a right to take away, such as a trial by jury and a personal protection of your property. Those are things that are guaranteed. It's just the idea that we as humans have these rights just because we're alive. Because we're humans, we have certain rights that no government is allowed to take away from us. And that's the idea of the Bill of Rights. In 1780, Massachusetts became the last of the 13 colonies to draw up its constitution. The Massachusetts Constitution was different because it gave all branches equal power instead of the legislature having most like in the other states. It would be the framework for the Constitution that would come later. So what happens here, the Massachusetts Constitution is a little bit different because where there was different parts of the government, Congress made up the main part of it in most of the governments. And even early on in our country, Congress was the most powerful part of the government because there hadn't been an executive or judicial branch established on a national level yet. That's what the Constitution does. And so, like during the American Revolution, there was Congress, and then the leaders in the Continental Army that was leading the war. There wasn't a president or nothing. It was just Congress that made most of the decisions. And so the Massachusetts Constitution is going to allow us to remove that to give equal branches of government. States did most of the government, but there were certain things the government could not do, such as raise taxes. They realized that to win a war with Great Britain, they needed to have a strong central government. And in 1777, the Congress detailed the plans for the Articles of Confederation, which is the first Constitution of the United States. Now, most people agree the Articles of Confederation was very weak. It wasn't very powerful. It wasn't very effective. It was basically like, hey, y'all, let's take this glue. This needs to be welded together, but let's take this glue so we can maybe it'll stay together till we win this war and go in there and weld it where it'll stay strong. And that was kind of the idea. The Articles of Confederation was there with the intention of being a temporary thing just used to get them through the war. Once they got through the war, most people knew they was going to have to come up with a better constitution. So it was a temporary thing. But they realized, look, we got to have a central government if we're going to win this because we got to be united. We got to work together. We can't have Maryland fighting this group, Massachusetts fighting this group, Pennsylvania fighting this group. We got to all be working together to defeat the British if we want to win. A confederation is a group of individuals. You see this a lot of times where, like, for example, Native Americans had a lot of confederations, which is where their tribes would kind of work together. It was a group of tribes that worked together. The Articles of Confederation established a system for cooperation between the states. It worked out the thing where they were all connected to each other. They established Congress as the only government body and gave them central powers. These powers were limited and didn't let them make taxes or enforce laws. So when it comes down to it, it didn't allow them to make taxes for everybody, and they couldn't enforce laws. They could pass laws, but they couldn't enforce them. And even today, Congress can't enforce laws. That's the job of the executive branch, or the one that the president heads up, or the governor of the state heads up. And so Congress could make laws, but they couldn't enforce them. And they could say, you need to pay taxes, but they couldn't enforce that. And so because of it, nobody was paying taxes, nobody was following the laws, and there was really nothing nobody could do. It's the reason why the Articles of Confederation was weak, because it limited the government to just Congress and just their ability and just what they could do at that time. And it was very little things that they were able to actually do. By 1781, all 13 states had ratified or approved the Articles of Confederation. So the word ratified means approved. You need to know that because we're going to talk a lot about ratifying things. The states are going to have to ratify the Constitution to become an actual state. You're going to have to ratify amendments and things like that. So ratification just means to approve. An attempt to amend or change the articles would require all 13 states' approval. So to amend or an amendment means to change something. We have 27 amendments to our Constitution. That means there's been 27 changes to the original Constitution. Now, the first 10 is the Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights was all established at one time. There was 10 of them that was established at one time. There's been 17 that's been added since then. And so that's what the word amend means. When the Congress passed laws, they couldn't enforce them. And again, that made the Articles of Confederation very weak. The United States was able to overcome their weaknesses to defeat Great Britain, and in 1783, they signed the Treaty of Paris to end the war. The country had serious financial problems after the war, and the citizens were heavily taxed after the war. Some soldiers weren't paid for what they were owed for fighting, and this is going to cause a lot of issues because what's happening here is the United States has won the war. That's great, but now how are they going to pay for the war debt? They got soldiers they got to pay. They got Congress they got to pay. They got repairs they got to make to our country because cities have been destroyed and occupied and taken over and everything else. And so there was a lot of cost that came with that, and they didn't really know what to do. Now, this is the same issue that's going to lead up to the American Revolution when, again, the Treaty of Paris was signed, except this Treaty of Paris ended the French and Indian War. After that, the British government had trouble paying back the debt from the French and Indian War, and so they started imposing more taxes on the citizens. It's just a repeat of what's happened. And so they have to grab control of this very quickly, because if not, it can escalate back into a thing where someone tried to take back over the government again, and that's what's going to happen. Riots broke out in numerous places, such as Shays' Rebellion, which was a rebellion that started over government overreach. Now, Shays' Rebellion is named after Daniel Shays, who did not start Shays' Rebellion. At first, he didn't want to get involved, but finally, enough was enough. He decided to get involved with the movement, and he was such a charismatic figure, such an important figure in that they wound up naming it after him. And what happens is there's a number of farmers and different people that comes home from the government or comes home from the war, and they haven't been paid. And a lot of times they say, "Oh, that was the reason for Shays' Rebellion, is they didn't get paid." Now the problem is they felt like they wasn't being represented by their government again. It was the same thing they just fought for. They literally just fought a war to not get paid. They come home and there's bills in the mailbox, and they're like, well, "What do? We just dedicated years of our life to fighting in this war for nothing. The government's taxing us like King George III did. They're not paying us what they owe us. I got bills to pay. My farm has been destroyed because of the war. My fields have been destroyed because of the war. And it was just chaotic. And that's going to lead to Shays' Rebellion. Now, they're able to put down Shays' Rebellion. And they're going to start realizing, well, we need a stronger government. So people were arguing for a stronger national government. In 1787, 12 of the states sent delegates to Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. And that's going to bring us to the end of this section and this chapter, and then we'll get into the Constitution in the next chapter and kind of a little bit about what the U.S. Constitution, how it came to be, and things like that. So that's all for this section. We will get back in section 3 with the U.S. Constitution.